Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into the swirling mists of Victorian England, a place where gas lamps cast long dancing shadows and the hushed whispers of the night held a peculiar power. Imagine yourself there, bundled in heavy wool, perhaps hearing the distant clip-clop of a hansom cab on cobbled streets, or the faint melancholic toll of Big Ben chiming the late hours. The air is thick with the scent of coal smoke and damp earth, and in the quiet of those grand, often drafty, houses, something truly unsettling begins to stir. You see, while you're tucked in now, all cozy and safe, you probably won't survive this journey into the bizarre and often terrifying world of Victorian sleepwalking without a shiver or two. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. I always love seeing how far these sleepy stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on a quiet, foggy London street. The year, perhaps 1888. The city breathes around you, a massive, enigmatic beast. Most people are deep in slumber, but not everyone. Not in this age, and certainly not with the peculiar anxieties that permeated Victorian life. This isn't just about someone getting up for a midnight snack. This is about an entire society grappling with a phenomenon that defied easy explanation. A phenomenon that blurred the lines between the conscious and the unconscious, between sanity and madness. Sleepwalking. Think about it. In an era obsessed with control, with social decorum, with rigid class structures, and even more rigid moral codes, the idea of someone completely losing control of their actions while seemingly asleep was profoundly disturbing. You, the Victorian citizen, were expected to be rational, to be composed, to present a flawless facade to the world. But what if, in the dead of night, your very body betrayed you? What if you, a respectable gentlewoman, found yourself wandering the moonlit garden in your nightdress, or a diligent clerk was discovered meticulously arranging papers in his office, all while utterly unconscious? It was, quite frankly, an absolute nightmare of a public relations problem for your psyche. The Victorians, bless their cotton socks, were absolutely fascinated by anything that hinted at the supernatural, the unknown, or the deeply psychological, even if they didn't have the language to articulate it as we do today. They were a people who built marvels of engineering and science, yet still clung to superstitions like a well-worn comfort blanket. Sleepwalking, or somnambulism, as the more learned folks preferred to call it, was one such captivating mystery. It wasn't just a quirky habit. It was often seen as a symptom, a sign, a portent. Was it a physical ailment, a moral failing, a touch of the demonic, or perhaps, most unsettling of all, a window into a hidden self, one that behaved quite differently from your waking persona? Historians still argue whether the Victorian obsession with sleepwalking was a genuine increase in cases or merely a heightened awareness, fueled by changing social norms and burgeoning medical interest. Imagine, if you will, the domestic scene. You've retired to your bedroom, the heavy velvet curtains drawn against the impenetrable night. You drift off to sleep, a respectable member of society. But then, as the clock ticks past midnight, something shifts. Your eyes, though unseeing, might flutter open. Your limbs, usually inert, begin to move with an eerie, unhesitating purpose. You might sit up, your mind a blank slate, and simply walk out of the room. Perhaps you descend the grand staircase, each step silent, your nightgown ghostly white in the moonlight filtering through the stained glass window. Maybe you unlock the front door and step out into the gaslit street, an utterly bizarre tableau for any late-night constable who might stumble upon you. The sheer impropriety of it all. A lady, unchaperoned, in her nightclothes, wandering the public thoroughfare. It was enough to make the fainting couch a necessity rather than a mere accessory. This wasn't just about a nocturnal stroll. Victorian sleepwalkers were reported to perform incredibly complex tasks. There were tales of individuals writing letters, playing musical instruments, even composing poetry, all while seemingly fast asleep. One widely circulated anecdote involved a young woman who, in her sleep, would descend to the kitchen, prepare a full meal, eat it, and return to bed, remembering nothing in the morning. Her family only discovered her nocturnal culinary adventures by the telltale crumbs and missing provisions. You can almost hear the collective gasp across the breakfast. Tables of polite society. Good heavens, did she remember to wipe her mouth? The very idea of an unconscious mind directing such actions was revolutionary and, for many, deeply unsettling. It challenged the prevailing Enlightenment view of man as a purely rational being, master of his own destiny and, more importantly, master of his own actions. If you weren't truly in control of your nighttime self, then who was? Was it some primal instinct bubbling up from below the polished veneer of Victorian respectability? Or was it something far more sinister, perhaps even supernatural? Mainstream historical fact. The 19th century saw a significant increase in medical and scientific inquiry into the nature of sleep, dreams, and abnormal sleep behaviors, moving away from purely superstitious explanations. Before this period, sleepwalking was often attributed to demonic possession, witchcraft, or simply a moral weakness. But as the age of reason bled into the Victorian era, and as medical science began to professionalize, there was a concerted effort to classify and understand these phenomena through a more empirical lens. Doctors, often pioneering the nascent fields of neurology and psychology, began to observe, record, and theorize about the mechanisms behind sleepwalking. You might find physicians poring over case notes, exchanging letters, and debating in learned societies about the true cause of somnambulism. They were still often hilariously off the mark, mind you. But at least they were trying to use a microscope instead of a crucifix. A quirky or fringe tidbit from the era concerns the belief that sleepwalkers were particularly susceptible to external influences. It was thought by some that a skilled mesmerist or hypnotist could, in fact, command a sleepwalker to perform specific actions. This bled into the stage acts of the time, where performers would claim to induce trance states and demonstrate seemingly miraculous feats of somnambulism, often to the delight and bewilderment of the paying public. You'd see advertisements for shows promising to reveal the mysteries of the sleeping mind, usually involving a volunteer or a carefully chosen stooge who would walk across the stage blindfolded, guided only by the mesmerist's whispered commands. It was part entertainment, part quackery, and all very, very Victorian. Come see the man who can make you fetch his slippers in your sleep. Astonishing. The social impact of sleepwalking was considerable. For families, a somnambulist in the house could be a source of constant anxiety. Would they injure themselves? Would they accidentally reveal family secrets? Would they, heaven forbid, wander out and commit some unthinkable act? Doors were locked, windows barred, and often family members would take turns keeping watch. The shame associated with such a condition was also palpable. To have a sleepwalker in the family was to have a vulnerability exposed, a chink in the armor of your carefully constructed public image. It suggested a lack of self-control, a susceptibility to forces unknown, which was antithetical to the Victorian ideal of robust self-possession. You can almost hear the hushed conversations behind gloved hands at a society tea. Did you hear about poor Mrs. Higgins? Her daughter was found arranging the vicar's garden gnomes in the middle of the night. Such a scandal. The very word somnambulism itself carried a certain mystique, a scientific veneer that nonetheless hinted at something deeply unsettling. It was a condition that fascinated, frightened, and ultimately forced Victorians to confront the very limits of their understanding of the human mind and its unpredictable depths. It was the original true crime podcast, but instead of detectives, you had doctors scratching their heads and gossips sharpening their tongues. And for you, the sleep-deprived observer, it's a window into a world where even your own bed offered no true sanctuary from the mysteries of the human condition. As the gas lamps flickered and the hansom cabs rattled on, the prevailing understanding of sleepwalking began its slow, cumbersome shift from the purely supernatural to something approaching the scientific. You see, for centuries before the Victorians got their hands on it, sleepwalking was firmly entrenched in the realm of the eerie and the unholy. It was the devil's work, plain and simple. If you found your neighbor wandering the moors at midnight, chanting strange incantations while seemingly comatose, your first thought wasn't perhaps he needs a neurologist, but rather quick, fetch the priest and some holy water. This ancient view, rooted deeply in folk beliefs and religious dogma, held that the sleepwalker was either possessed by malevolent spirits, cursed by a witch, or perhaps even a witch themselves, flying off to some unholy Sabbath. The person's soul was thought to have temporarily departed the body, leaving it a hollow vessel for darker forces. Or perhaps it was just a sign of God's displeasure. Imagine the terror of being a sleepwalker in such an age, knowing that your nocturnal ramblings could literally lead to an accusation of witchcraft and a very unpleasant end. No wonder people kept their nighttime perambulations a secret. But as the 19th century dawned, bringing with it the hum of industrial machinery and the relentless march of scientific inquiry, these old superstitions, while still lingering in the shadows of rural communities, began to rub uncomfortably against the burgeoning spirit of rationalism. Doctors, who were slowly gaining more respect and understanding of the human body, started to look at sleepwalking not as a spiritual affliction, but as a bodily one. It was a kind of medical puzzle to be solved, rather than a spiritual battle. To be one, you can almost picture them peering intently at patients, jotting down notes with quill pens, convinced they were on the cusp of some grand neurological revelation. Early medical theories, however, were often just as wild and wonderful as the superstitions they sought to replace, albeit with a smattering of Latin and Greek terms to make them sound more official. One popular theory revolved around the idea of humors, an ancient concept, mind you, but one that stubbornly persisted. It was believed that an imbalance of bodily fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, could lead to all sorts of ailments, including sleepwalking. Perhaps too much black bile made you melancholy and prone to nocturnal wanderings, or an excess of phlegm caused a sluggishness that manifested as a confused, sleep-driven state. So, a physician might prescribe purges, bleedings, or special diets to rebalance these mystical fluids, hoping to cure the somnambulist. You can practically hear the patient sighing, "Oh, not another leech's treatment, doctor." Another prominent theory focused on the brain, but in a very rudimentary way. Some physicians proposed that sleepwalking was caused by an irregular flow of nervous fluid or an excitation of the brain's motor centers, while the sensory and intellectual faculties remained asleep. It was like a faulty switchboard where the wires for movement were still humming along, but the lights for consciousness were firmly off. This theory had a certain logic to it, suggesting that the brain was simply mishandling its nighttime duties. They might recommend cold compresses to the head or strong smelling salts to wake up the errant brain. Then there was the more dramatic, and perhaps more Victorian, idea that sleepwalking was a symptom of hysteria. Hysteria, you remember, was the catch-all diagnosis for almost any unexplained female ailment, from nervousness to fainting spells, and sleepwalking fit neatly into this expansive, often dismissive category. The wandering woman, a figure already fraught with social anxieties, became even more so when her wandering was involuntary and occurred at night. It was seen as a manifestation of repressed emotions, a nervous disorder stemming from the delicate female constitution. For male sleepwalkers, explanations tended to veer more towards overwork, stress, or even excessive reading, because, clearly, reading too many novels could make you walk into a hedge in your pajamas. This shift from demonic possession to bodily malfunction or mental imbalance represented a significant step forward, even if the cures were often ineffective or even harmful. It brought sleepwalking into the realm of medical discourse, making it something that could be studied, catalogued, and, theoretically, treated. Doctors began compiling case histories, trying to identify patterns and common triggers. They observed that sleepwalking often occurred during specific stages of sleep. Though they didn't have the sophisticated tools to measure sleep cycles as we do today, they also noticed that stress, anxiety, and fevers seemed to exacerbate the condition. Mainstream historical fact. By the mid-19th century, prominent medical texts and journals extensively debated the physiological and psychological causes of somnambulism, largely divorcing it from supernatural explanations. Doctors like James Braid, a Scottish surgeon who coined the term hypnotism, contributed to the understanding of trance states, which sometimes blurred with descriptions of sleepwalking. His work, and that of others, emphasized the influence of the nervous system and the mind, even if their understanding was rudimentary by modern standards. You would find detailed clinical descriptions, often with very little follow-up, published in journals like The Lancet, offering tantalizing glimpses into this mysterious nocturnal world. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this period is the occasional, rather bizarre, belief that a sleepwalker could be cured by a sudden shock, such as a cold bath or even a loud noise. Imagine, if you will, a frantic Victorian family, upon discovering their loved one sleepwalking, immediately dragging them to a frigid, unheated bathtub in the dead of winter. It sounds more like a form of torture than a cure, doesn't it? The reasoning, such as it was that a powerful sensory jolt would snap the unconscious mind back into full wakefulness and break the pattern. Unsurprisingly, this method often resulted in a very wet, very angry, and still sleepwalking individual. Probably didn't do wonders for family harmony either. The public, for their part, watched these medical advancements with a mix of awe and skepticism. While science was fascinating, the old stories died hard. For many, the idea that a person could perform complex actions without conscious awareness still felt deeply unsettling, almost magical. It chipped away at the comforting certainty of a clear distinction between wakefulness and sleep, between control and utter abandon. You, the average Victorian, might read about these scientific theories in the popular press, perhaps nodding sagely at the intellectual jargon, but still, deep down, you might wonder if there wasn't a little bit of the uncanny involved. After all, what truly explained the sleepwalker who played the piano flawlessly, despite never having learned to play while awake? That sort of thing still raised eyebrows, and perhaps a few goosebumps. Historians still argue whether the increase in reported sleepwalking cases during the Victorian era was a genuine medical phenomenon, or simply a reflection of growing public and medical interest. It's a classic chicken and egg situation, isn't it? Did more people actually start sleepwalking? Or did more people simply start talking about it, categorizing it, and bringing it to the attention of doctors? The rise of popular fiction, which we'll get to later, certainly played a role in sensationalizing and disseminating tales of somnambulism, making the public more aware and perhaps more likely to identify the condition in themselves or their family members. The cultural impact of these early medical musings can't be overstated. It opened up a space for discussing the unconscious, a concept that would later be fully explored by the likes of Freud, even if the doctors of the time didn't fully grasp the psychological underpinnings. They laid the groundwork by acknowledging that the mind could operate on different levels, some of which were beyond our immediate conscious control. It chipped away at the idea of the perfectly rational human being, revealing instead a more complex, layered, and often unpredictable inner world. You might imagine yourself attending a lecture at a medical society, listening to a Dr. Erasmus Finch, a wholly fictional, yet perfectly plausible Victorian physician, present his latest findings on the nocturnal perambulations of the nervous constitution. He would meticulously detail cases, perhaps even bring in a patient's diary if they kept one during their waking hours, and pontificate on the causes. He might suggest that certain foods, or even the moonlight itself, played a role. It was a fascinating, often contradictory, but always earnest attempt to bring light to a dark, confusing corner of human experience. And as you sat there, you'd probably shift uncomfortably, wondering if you, too, might possess some hidden, wandering self, just waiting for the dead of night to emerge. With the nascent medical community scratching their heads and pontificating about humors and nervous fluids, it was perhaps inevitable that the dramatic and mysterious nature of sleepwalking would seize the imagination of Victorian authors. You See, the era was absolutely ravenous for tales of the unknown, the thrilling, and the morally ambiguous. And what could be more ambiguously thrilling than a character who commits strange acts while utterly unconscious? It was a ready-made plot device, a narrative goldmine that allowed writers to explore themes of hidden identities, repressed desires, madness, and the blurred lines between good and evil, all without having to resort to, well, outright magic or blatant supernaturalism. So you, the avid Victorian reader, would find yourself curled up by the fire, gaslight flickering, devouring novels where sleepwalking wasn't just a quirky habit, but a pivotal moment of revelation or terror. It offered a convenient, if somewhat sensationalized, explanation for bizarre behavior. A character could commit a seemingly heinous act, reveal a deep secret, or even wander into a dangerous situation, and then, upon waking, remember absolutely nothing. This created delicious suspense for the reader and a fascinating moral dilemma for the characters. Was the sleepwalker truly guilty if they weren't conscious? Or was the act a manifestation of some dark, repressed corner of their soul, finally breaking free in the unguarded hours of the night? Consider, for a moment, the Gothic novels that were so immensely popular. Think of the sprawling, shadowy mansions, the ancestral curses, the brooding heroes, and the often fainting heroines. Sleepwalking fit perfectly into this atmospheric landscape. It added an extra layer of psychological horror, a sense of internal unease that was far more insidious than an external monster. The monster, in these cases, was often within the character themselves. Perhaps the seemingly innocent governess secretly harbored dark thoughts that emerged during her nocturnal wanderings, or the respectable patriarch was revealed to be a secret gambler whose sleep-addled mind led him to the card table. The possibilities for dramatic revelations were endless. One of the most famous examples, and a mainstream historical fact in the literary world, is Lady Macbeth in William Shakespeare's Macbeth. While Shakespeare predates the Victorian era, his enduring influence meant that Lady Macbeth's iconic sleepwalking scene was a touchstone for Victorian audiences and writers. Her tormented nocturnal confession of guilt, the scrubbing of imaginary blood from her hands, out damned spot, out, I say, perfectly encapsulated the idea of a guilty conscience manifesting in unconscious action. Victorian playwrights and novelists, drawing inspiration from this powerful precedent, recognized the immense dramatic potential. You would have seen countless stage adaptations where her frantic, candlelit wanderings sent shivers down the spines of the audience, reminding them that even the most hardened criminal might betray themselves in their sleep. But beyond Shakespeare, Victorian literature embraced the somnambulist with open arms. You might stumble upon sensation novels, a genre designed to shock and thrill, where sleepwalking was a common trope. Wilkie Collins, a master of the genre, often incorporated psychological mysteries into his intricate plots. While not exclusively centered on sleepwalking, his work, like The Woman in White, often played with themes of identity, madness, and manipulation, where characters might be drugged or deceived into unconscious acts. The idea that one's body could be controlled or appear to be controlled by forces beyond their conscious will was a rich vein for him to mine. Less obvious, perhaps, but equally potent, was the use of sleepwalking in stories that explored social anxieties. Imagine a young woman pressured into a marriage she despises, whose subconscious rebellion manifests as sleepwalking. She might try to escape the house, destroy an engagement ring, or even reveal her true feelings to an unsuitable suitor, all while ostensibly asleep. Upon waking, she would have no memory, creating a dramatic tension between her conscious repression and her unconscious desires. It was a clever way for authors to comment on the suffocating social norms of the time without being overtly critical, allowing the madness of the sleepwalker to serve as a metaphor for the deeper societal pressures. A quirky or fringe tidbit is the emergence of mesmeric somnambulism in literature. This wasn't natural sleepwalking, but rather a state induced by a mesmerist or hypnotist. It played into the public's fascination with mesmerism, a pseudoscience that claimed to control individuals through magnetic forces. In these stories, a nefarious character might mesmerize someone and command them to commit a crime, reveal secrets, or even fall in love. You could imagine a melodramatic scene where the villain, with his piercing eyes and flowing cape, whispers commands to a helpless heroine, who then proceeds to sleepwalk to her doom, or perhaps to his arms. It was a potent mix of science fiction and psychological thriller, tapping into fears about mind control and the vulnerability of the individual. Beware the hypnotist, dear reader, for he may command your very dreams. This literary device also served a practical purpose for authors. It allowed for plot twists that might otherwise seem implausible. Need a character to discover a crucial piece of evidence in a locked room. Have them sleepwalk into it. Need a character to deliver exposition without realizing it. Let them mumble secrets in their sleep-induced trance. It was a convenient way to move the plot forward, add a layer of intrigue, and explore the psychological depths of characters in ways that overt conscious action might not permit. Historians still argue whether these literary portrayals accurately reflected real-life instances of sleepwalking or merely exaggerated them for dramatic effect, shaping public perception rather than merely mirroring it. It's likely a bit of both, a feedback loop where fiction influenced understanding and understanding influenced fiction. Consider the popular press to penny dreadfuls and serialized novels consumed by the working classes often featured sensationalized tales of sleepwalkers involved in murders, robberies, or scandalous affairs. These stories fed the public's appetite for the macabre and the mysterious, often blurring the line between entertainment and genuine fear. You might read about the somnambulist slayer of Fleet Street, a lurid tale of a man who committed a series of grisly murders in his sleep, leaving no conscious memory of his deeds. While utterly fantastical, these stories contributed to the widespread belief that sleepwalking was not merely an oddity, but potentially a dangerous, unpredictable condition. The inclusion of sleepwalking in literature also highlighted the growing interest in the human psyche, even before the formal establishment of psychology as a field. Authors were, in their own way, amateur psychologists, exploring the complexities of human behavior, motivation, and the unconscious mind. They understood, intuitively, that people often had hidden depths, secret fears, and desires that were not always apparent on the surface. Sleepwalking became a symbol for these hidden aspects of the self, a literal manifestation of the shadow self that lurked beneath the veneer of Victorian respectability. You might find yourself at a lively soiree where the conversation turns to the latest serialized novel and someone breathlessly recounts the scene where the heroine sleepwalks onto a perilous rooftop. The ladies would fan themselves dramatically, the gentlemen would stroke their beards thoughtfully, and everyone would marvel at the wonders or horrors of the sleeping mind. It became part of the cultural lexicon, a shorthand for extreme psychological distress or suppressed secrets. Ultimately, the literary somnambulist served as a fascinating mirror to Victorian anxieties about control, identity, and the mysteries of the human mind. It allowed authors to push boundaries, explore taboos, and create compelling narratives that resonated deeply with a public grappling with rapid social change and an ever-expanding scientific frontier. For you, the reader, it offered a thrilling escape into a world where even sleep held its own dark, unpredictable secrets. And as you put down your book and extinguish the gas lamp, you might just find yourself checking that the bedroom door is securely locked, just in case your own unconscious decided to go on a little adventure. Having been thoroughly entertained and perhaps a little unsettled by the literary antics of sleepwalkers, you, the discerning Victorian citizen, would have noticed a definite shift in how the phenomenon was discussed in broader society. The days of simply burning someone at the stake for nocturnal wanderings were, thankfully, largely over, at least in polite British society. Instead, public perceptions of sleepwalking began to evolve, moving from outright superstitious terror to a more nuanced, though still often bewildered, understanding. This wasn't a sudden, revolutionary leap, mind you, but more of a slow, creeping tide, influenced by those early medical musings and, ironically, by the very sensationalized stories that made sleepwalking a household term. At the dawn of the Victorian era, remnants of the old beliefs still clung stubbornly, especially in rural areas where ancient folklore held sway. If someone in a remote village was found wandering in a trance-like state, the immediate whispers might still turn to changelings or fae-folk, or perhaps a particularly nasty curse laid upon the family. The village elder might still recommend remedies involving charms or certain herbs gathered under a full moon. This was the slow, difficult work of disentangling centuries of deeply ingrained superstition. It's a bit like trying to remove a stubborn stain from a Victorian waistcoat. It takes time, effort, and often you're left with a faint, persistent mark. However, in the burgeoning urban centers, particularly London, Manchester, and Birmingham, where scientific societies flourished and public lectures on mesmerism and phrenology drew curious crowds, the conversation began to take on a more scientific flavor. Sleepwalking started to be discussed as a nervous complaint or a disorder of the brain. This wasn't necessarily a more comforting diagnosis, mind you, but it did shift the blame from divine displeasure or demonic influence to something internal, something that perhaps medicine could eventually conquer. You might hear learned gentlemen at your club debating the latest theories, perhaps offering their own anecdotes of a distant cousin who once sleepwalked all the way to the garden shed to prune the roses in the dead of winter. A most curious case, I assure you, entirely due to an imbalance of the humors, don't you know? The rise of the popular press played an enormous role in shaping these perceptions. Newspapers, with their insatiable appetite for sensationalism, would report on cases of sleepwalking with vivid detail, often exaggerating the more dramatic aspects. you'd find headlines screaming about nocturnal assassins or somnambulist thieves, even if the actual cases were far more mundane. These reports, while often factually dubious, brought the concept of sleepwalking into countless homes, making it a topic of conversation across all social strata. It's like today's viral videos, but with more corsets and less cat memes. Everyone was talking about it, often with a mixture of morbid fascination and genuine fear. This public discourse, fueled by both medical theories and popular narratives, led to a more generalized acceptance that sleepwalking was a real, albeit baffling, phenomenon. It wasn't just something that happened in distant lands or to the particularly unfortunate. It could happen to anyone. This fostered a strange blend of empathy and anxiety. On one hand, there was a greater understanding that sleepwalkers weren't necessarily evil or possessed, but rather afflicted. On the other hand, the unpredictability of the condition instilled a new kind of fear. What if you started sleepwalking? What might you do? Mainstream historical fact. The Victorian era witnessed the widespread acceptance of somnambulism as a legitimate medical and psychological phenomenon, albeit one still poorly understood, moving it out of the sole domain of folklore and into the realm of scientific inquiry and popular discussion. This shift was evident in the burgeoning medical literature, newspaper reports, and the integration of sleepwalking into popular culture, signifying a collective intellectual grappling with the mysteries of the unconscious mind. You could see this in the shift from simple exorcisms to more medical interventions. However rudimentary, a quirky or fringe tidbit related to this public shift was the fascination with so-called spiritualist somnambulists. In the heyday of spiritualism, individuals claiming to be in a sleep-like trance would perform seances, communicate with the dead, or even offer prophecies. These mediums often claimed their abilities were heightened while in a somnambulistic state, allowing their spirits to commune with the other side. You'd find yourself in a dimly lit parlor, perhaps with a table levitating slightly, or so it seemed, listening to a figure who claimed to be a sleepwalking channel for departed souls. It blurred the lines between genuine physiological condition, theatrical performance, and outright fraud, all while capitalizing on the public's evolving understanding or misunderstanding of the unconscious mind. Come, dear sir, for a mere shilling, speak to your departed aunt, channeled through our entranced somnambulist. It was an interesting blend of scientific curiosity and old-fashioned gullibility. The emergence of psychology, even in its most nascent forms, also played a part. While Freud was still a young man, the groundwork was being laid for understanding the unconscious, concepts of hidden desires, suppressed trauma, and the complex interplay between mind and body began to filter into popular thought, albeit in simplified or distorted forms. Sleepwalking, therefore, became a visible symptom of these hidden depths. It was seen as the mind, in its unguarded state, revealing what the conscious mind tried so desperately to conceal. This made it both terrifying and endlessly fascinating. For you, the Victorian householder, dealing with a sleepwalker in the family required practical adaptations. Doors might be locked from the outside, bells might be attached to bedroom doors, or even ropes might be tied to wrists as a crude alarm system. There was a desperate need to prevent injury, or worse, public scandal. Imagine the anxiety of a mother whose child was prone to sleepwalking. fearing they might wander out into the dangerous streets of London or fall down a flight of stairs. This practical concern underscored the shift from seeing sleepwalking as purely a spiritual curse to a tangible, physical risk that needed to be managed. Historians still argue whether the perceived increase in sleepwalking cases was a real epidemiological trend or simply a result of more accurate diagnosis and reporting. Were the damp, gaslit conditions of Victorian homes somehow conducive to nocturnal perambulations? Or was it simply that people, now armed with a new vocabulary and a new framework for understanding, began to identify and label behaviors that had previously been dismissed as eccentricity or simply acting out? The truth, as ever, probably, lies somewhere in the middle. The very act of naming and discussing a phenomenon gives it a certain reality, doesn't it? So, while the Victorians might not have fully grasped the complex neurological processes behind sleepwalking, their public perception evolved dramatically. It became less about brimstone and more about brain function, less about curses and more about cures, however misguided. It was a testament to their insatiable curiosity and their persistent attempts to categorize and understand the world around them, even the parts that defied easy explanation. And as you put away your newspaper, perhaps you'd glance nervously at the bedroom door, wondering what secrets your own sleeping mind might hold, and what public spectacle it might inadvertently create. As public perceptions of sleepwalking slowly shifted from the purely demonic to the vaguely medical, the burgeoning Victorian press, with its insatiable appetite for the sensational, found itself with a new obsession: the real-life notorious. You see, while literature provided a thrilling escape, there was nothing quite like a true story, however embellished, to capture the public imagination. These were the cases that made headlines, sparked frantic dinner-table discussions, and contributed to the collective fascination and fear surrounding somnambulism. You, the avid newspaper reader, would devour every lurid detail, wondering if such strange occurrences could truly be real. These weren't just the quiet, domestic wanderings we've discussed. These were the dramatic, the bizarre, and sometimes the tragic cases that pushed sleepwalking into the public consciousness in a profound way. Imagine opening your morning broadsheet, perhaps while sipping your weak tea, only to be confronted with a story of a man who, in his sleep, had apparently climbed onto his rooftop, believing he was scaling a mountain, or a woman who, while in a trance, meticulously rearranged an entire library by subject and author, a feat she couldn't accomplish in her waking hours. These tales, whether entirely factual or liberally spiced with journalistic flair, became the cautionary legends of the age. One of the most widely reported and fascinating categories of notorious sleepwalkers involved those who committed crimes while supposedly asleep. This threw a massive spanner into the rigid gears of Victorian justice and morality. If you, in your sleep, accidentally set fire to your neighbor's prize-winning petunias, were you truly culpable? What if the act was far more serious, a violent assault, or even a murder? These cases forced judges and juries to grapple with the very nature of intent and responsibility, concepts that were foundational to their legal system. Consider the famous, albeit somewhat murky, case of Antoine Leblanc, a Canadian farmer whose trial for murder in the 1880s garnered significant attention. While not strictly Victorian English, the legal and public debates surrounding his defense of sleepwalking echoed across the Atlantic. Leblanc claimed he had committed a brutal murder while in a somnambulistic state, recalling nothing of the act upon waking. The court, and by extension the public, was utterly flummoxed. How could one be punished for actions committed by a body devoid of conscious direction? This legal labyrinth, which we'll explore more deeply later, was sparked by these very real and often horrifying cases. You can imagine the barristers, wig askew, trying to explain to a bewildered jury that the defendant's body was present, but his mind was off somewhere, perhaps dreaming of tea cakes and unicorns, while his hands were otherwise occupied. Another type of notorious sleepwalker involved those who seemed to exhibit extraordinary skills or knowledge while in their nocturnal trance. These were the somnambulist savants, whose feats defied rational explanation and often bordered on the miraculous. There were reports of individuals, usually young women, who, while asleep, could play complex musical pieces they had never learned, speak foreign languages they didn't know, or even draw intricate architectural plans. One particularly popular account, often exaggerated in the papers, told of a young domestic servant girl who, in her sleep, would recite passages from classical Greek texts, much to the astonishment of her uneducated family. Upon waking, she would revert to her usual unlettered self. Such stories fueled both scientific curiosity and, predictably, accusations of trickery or outright fraud. Was it a genuine, albeit rare, manifestation of the unconscious mind, or simply a clever hoax designed to gain notoriety or escape dull domestic duties? Historians still argue whether these seemingly superhuman feats were genuine, examples of unconscious capabilities, or elaborate hoaxes designed for personal gain or public amusement. Then there were the wandering sleepwalkers, whose nocturnal adventures took them far afield and often landed them in comical or dangerous predicaments. You might read about the respectable gentleman found 3 miles from his home, clad only in his nightshirt, trying to direct traffic in the middle of Piccadilly Circus, utterly oblivious to the gaping stares of passers-by. Or the young lady discovered perched precariously on a garden wall, convinced she was a bird ready for flight. These tales, while often played for laughs in the popular press, also underscored the inherent dangers of the condition. Falling from a height, wandering into a river, or being hit by a carriage were very real risks for the unwary somnambulist. For you, reading these accounts, it might have been a source of dark amusement, tempered by a nervous glance at your own bedroom window. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this era involves the occasional phenomenon of shared sleepwalking or contagious somnambulism. While perhaps not notorious in the individual sense, there were scattered reports, often anecdotal, of entire households or groups of people seemingly sleepwalking simultaneously, sometimes performing coordinated actions. This was often attributed to a form of shared hysteria, or, in more superstitious circles, a collective haunting. Imagine the sheer chaos of an entire family, from grandparents to small children, all sleepwalking through the house at once, bumping into each other like a ghostly game of blind man's bluff. While likely exaggerated or misinterpretations of collective anxiety, these stories added another layer of bizarre fascination to the already mysterious world of somnambulism. It sounds like something straight out of a particularly strange music hall sketch, doesn't it? The public's appetite for these notorious cases was insatiable. They provided drama, mystery, and a convenient vehicle for discussing the boundaries of human behavior and responsibility. They also helped to normalize, to some extent, the idea of sleepwalking as a real thing, even if it was often sensationalized. By seeing reports of sleepwalking in the newspapers, it ceased to be a whispered superstition and became a topic that could be openly, if excitedly, discussed. Did you read about the sleepwalking financier who almost gave away his entire fortune? Last night, the sheer terror, mainstream historical fact, sensationalized newspaper accounts of real-life sleepwalking incidents, particularly those involving crimes or extraordinary feats, significantly shaped public perception and fueled widespread fascination with the phenomenon throughout Victorian England. These reports, often found in publications like the Illustrated London News or Penny Dreadfuls, brought the concept of somnambulism to a mass audience, reinforcing both its mysterious nature and its potential dangers. It was the original clickbait, designed to sell papers and keep the populace captivated. These accounts also played a role in pushing the medical community to further investigate. If a crime was committed by a sleepwalker, a doctor might be called upon to testify, forcing them to articulate their understanding of the condition in a public, legally significant setting. This demand for answers, even if tentative, helped to formalize the study of sleep disorders. The legal system, though slow and ponderous, often served as an unwitting catalyst for scientific inquiry. As strange cases demanded explanation, for you witnessing these stories unfold in print, it was a constant reminder of the unpredictable nature of the human mind. Even in an age obsessed with order and control, there were forces at play within the individual that defied easy categorization. It was a fascinating paradox. The more science tried to explain sleepwalking, the more mysterious and compelling it seemed to become in the public eye. And as you finished your article, you might glance nervously at your own bedroom door, wondering what secrets your own unconscious mind might hold, and what headline-grabbing antics it might perform when you finally drifted off to sleep. Perhaps tonight you'd just dream of a nice cup of tea and a quiet, uneventful night. One can only hope. As you navigate the curious intellectual landscape of Victorian England, moving from whispered superstitions and sensationalized headlines, you encounter an even more ethereal and captivating aspect of sleepwalking's public life: its curious intersection with spiritualism. This was an age, remember, where the veil between the living and the dead felt thinner than ever. The Industrial Revolution, with its harsh realities and burgeoning scientific materialism, paradoxically seemed to drive many into the arms of the supernatural. People craved connection, meaning, and reassurance in a rapidly changing world, and spiritualism, with its promise of communication with the departed, offered just that. And right at the heart of this burgeoning movement, often providing its most dramatic manifestations, were individuals who claimed to be spiritualist somnambulists. Imagine yourself in a dimly lit Victorian parlor, perhaps the very air heavy with the scent of lilies or something vaguely chemical used to induce a trance. A group of earnest, expectant faces stares intently at a central figure, often a young woman, delicately built, her eyes closed, seemingly in a deep sleep. This, you are told, is the medium, a vessel through which spirits will communicate, and frequently the state she was in was described as a form of somnambulism, a trance-like sleep during which her spirit or the spirits of others could travel freely, gather information, and deliver messages from beyond the grave. This wasn't the kind of sleepwalking where someone might rearrange the furniture. This was elevated, ethereal sleepwalking. The medium might begin to speak in a voice not her own, or write messages on a slate, or even cause objects to move, all while supposedly asleep and unaware of her actions. It was the ultimate psychological puzzle wrapped in a spiritual enigma. For the devout spiritualist, this was irrefutable proof of an afterlife and the power of the human spirit. For the skeptic, it was a prime example of fraud, self-deception, or perhaps a genuine psychological state being exploited for profit and attention. The concept was simple, yet profound. If the conscious mind was truly asleep, then perhaps the subconscious, or even the soul itself, was freer to connect with other realms. Sleepwalking, in this context, was reinterpreted not as a malfunction, but as a heightened state, a doorway to other dimensions. You could literally wander into the spirit world, or allow its denizens to wander into you. It offered a seemingly scientific explanation for supernatural phenomena, bridging the gap between the material and the immaterial in a way that resonated deeply with the Victorian yearning for both reason and spiritual comfort. Mainstream historical fact: during the peak of the spiritualist movement in Victorian England, particularly from the 1850s to the 1880s, many mediums claimed to enter a somnambulistic or trance state to communicate with spirits, thus intertwining sleepwalking with the popular pursuit of the supernatural. This gave sleepwalking a new cultural significance, elevating it from a mere medical oddity to a potential gateway to the afterlife. You would find countless advertisements for seances featuring trance mediums and somnambulist psychics, promising revelations from the spectral plane. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this spiritualist angle involved the automatic writing often attributed to somnambulistic mediums. While in their alleged trance, they would furiously scribble pages of text, claiming it was dictated by a departed spirit. These writings often contained messages, prophecies, or even philosophical treatises. Sometimes the handwriting would change dramatically, supposedly reflecting the hand of a different spirit. Imagine seeing a refined lady who normally wrote with a delicate script, suddenly scrawling aggressive, masculine handwriting, claiming it was her deceased pirate ancestor dictating a treasure map, while almost certainly a product of the subconscious or outright trickery. These performances further blurred the line between the unconscious mind and external supernatural influence, captivating the public and adding to the mystique of sleepwalking. The famous Fox sisters, American spiritualists who gained immense popularity and toured England, often employed similar techniques, although their rappings and table tipping were less about physical sleepwalking and more about induced trance states that audiences perceived as altered consciousness. You would pay good money to witness these phenomena, sitting in rapt silence, hoping for a sign from your dear departed Aunt Mildred. The medium's state, whether genuine somnambulism or an elaborate performance, was crucial to the illusion. This spiritualist interpretation of sleepwalking provided a fascinating counterpoint to the purely medical view. While doctors sought to pathologize and explain sleepwalking through physiology, spiritualists sought to mystify and elevate it through metaphysics. You could choose your own adventure, so to speak. Was the person wandering in the night merely suffering from a nervous disorder, or were they genuinely experiencing a spiritual journey? This open, scholarly debate continues in different forms. Even today, historians still argue whether the phenomena observed in spiritualist seances were genuine instances of altered states of consciousness like sleepwalking, elaborate hoaxes, or a complex interplay of psychological suggestion and performance. The public's engagement with these spiritualist somnambulists was complex. For some, it provided solace and hope, a belief that loved ones were not truly gone. For others, it was a thrilling form of entertainment, a spectacle that defied rational explanation. And for a growing number of skeptics, it was a charade, a cynical exploitation of human grief and credulity. Critics, often magicians or former spiritualists themselves, would demonstrate how the tricks were done, explaining how supposedly somnambulistic feats could be achieved through sleight of hand, clever stagecraft, or even simple cold reading. The spiritualist connection also had a profound impact on how sleepwalking was perceived by those who experienced it. If you were a sleepwalker, perhaps prone to strange utterances or movements, you might be encouraged by spiritualist family members to embrace your gift rather than seek a medical cure. You might be told you were a natural medium, capable of contacting spirits, rather than simply having a sleep disorder. This could lead to genuinely confused individuals being exploited or encouraged into states that were detrimental to their well-being. It was a time before ethical guidelines in research or therapy were clearly established. So pretty much anything went in the pursuit of supernatural validation or profit. Ultimately, the spiritualist angle added an extraordinary layer of mystique and cultural relevance to sleepwalking. It wasn't just about what your body did when your mind was asleep. It was about what your soul might do. It fed into the broader Victorian fascination with the unseen, the unspoken, and the unexplainable. It was a reflection of a society grappling with profound changes, seeking answers in both the scientific laboratory and the dimly lit seance room. And as you left that simulated parlor, perhaps a little lightheaded from the incense and the hushed whispers, you might wonder about the true nature of consciousness and whether, perhaps, your own dreams held more than just random images, but a potential whisper from another world. Or, more likely, you'd just be wondering if that table really moved. It probably didn't. Having delved into the shadowy parlors of spiritualism and the sensational headlines of the press, you now find yourself standing at the imposing gates of Victorian justice, a place where the curious phenomenon of sleepwalking took on an entirely new and often perplexing dimension, the legal labyrinth of night. In an era obsessed with order, responsibility, and the strict adherence to laws, the idea of someone committing an actevin, a serious crime, while completely unconscious, posed a profound challenge to the very foundations of legal accountability. If the mind wasn't present, could the body be held responsible? It was a question that baffled judges, bewildered juries, and led to some truly remarkable courtroom dramas. Imagine, if you will, the scene: a stern-faced judge in his wig, a jury of 12 respectable gentlemen, and a defendant looking utterly distraught, perhaps still half believing they are caught in a nightmare. The charge, perhaps assault, theft, or even arson. The defense: my client was sleepwalking, Your Honor. For a Victorian court, accustomed to clear-cut cases of intent and malice aforethought, this was akin to suggesting the crime was committed by a ghost. It defied logical explanation and the prevailing understanding of human agency. The core legal principle at stake was mens rea, Latin for guilty mind. In common law, for most crimes to be proven, it wasn't enough that a person committed the act, actus reus. They also had to have the mental state, the intent to commit it. If a sleepwalker, by definition, lacked consciousness and intent, then how could they possess a guilty mind? This created a legal loophole, or rather, a legal abyss, into which many a Victorian lawyer, bravely or foolishly, ventured. Early cases involving sleepwalking as a defense were met with deep skepticism, often dismissed as a desperate attempt to evade justice. Judges would scratch their heads, juries would murmur, and the public would scoff. It sounded, frankly, too convenient. Oh, he stole the family silver. He must have been sleepwalking. What a tale. However, as medical understanding, however rudimentary, of somnambulism began to filter into the public consciousness, and as eminent physicians were called upon to testify, the courts were forced to take the defense more seriously. Mainstream historical fact: Victorian courts grappled significantly with the legal implications of sleepwalking, particularly in cases where individuals committed crimes while allegedly in a somnambulistic state, challenging established notions of mens rea and criminal responsibility. These cases, though rare, were often widely publicized and debated, pushing the boundaries of legal and medical understanding. You would find newspaper reports detailing the bewildered reactions of juries and the elaborate, often contradictory, testimonies of medical experts trying to explain the inexplicable, a key turning point, or at least a frequently cited case in the legal annals of sleepwalking, often involved Canadian common law, which influenced British legal thinking. The case of R.V. Fane, 1881, although Canadian, illustrated the complexities. Fane was accused of murder and claimed he was sleepwalking. While the details are complex and the ultimate verdict mixed, it highlighted the growing willingness of legal systems, influenced by medical opinion, to consider sleepwalking as a valid defense that negated criminal intent. It wasn't an automatic acquittal, mind you, but it opened the door for genuine legal debate rather than outright dismissal. Imagine the courtroom tension as the defense lawyer meticulously built a case around the idea that the defendant's body was merely a puppet, and the true puppeteer, his conscious mind, was safely tucked away in dreamland. A quirky or fringe tidbit from these legal discussions involves the concept of partial consciousness in sleepwalking. Some legal minds and medical experts theorized that sleepwalkers weren't entirely unconscious, but existed in a foggy, hypnotizing semi-aware state. This, they argued, might still allow for a degree of unconscious intent or negligence that could still warrant some form of legal accountability, even if not a full murder charge. It was a legal tightrope walk, trying to define a state of mind that defied clear definition. So, Instead of a clean, guilty or not guilty, you might have arguments for guilty, but only half awake, which sounds like something straight out of a particularly confusing dream, doesn't it? He was only 37% responsible, Your Honor. The challenge for the defense was immense. How do you prove someone was sleepwalking? There was no brain scanning technology, no definitive medical tests. It relied heavily on witness testimony. He had a faraway look in his eyes, and the opinions of often divided medical experts. The prosecution, naturally, would argue that sleepwalking was a convenient fabrication, a desperate lie to escape justice. They would point to any shred of evidence suggesting conscious planning or memory. It often devolved into a battle of expert witnesses, with one doctor solemnly declaring the defendant was a genuine somnambulist, while another vehemently insisted it was all an elaborate charade. Historians still argue whether the legal system's increasing acceptance of the sleepwalking defense reflected a genuine evolution in understanding the human mind, or was simply a pragmatic response to the baffling nature of such cases. Was it true enlightenment, or just a recognition that a jury couldn't reasonably convict someone for an act they genuinely had no memory of committing? The impact, however, was undeniable. These cases forced the legal establishment to acknowledge the complex interplay between the conscious and unconscious mind, an early crack in the rigid edifice of legal positivism. The stakes were incredibly high. For the defendant, a conviction could mean imprisonment, transportation, or even death. For the victim's family, it meant potentially seeing their assailant walk free on what seemed like a flimsy excuse. For society, it questioned the very principle of free will and personal responsibility. If you could commit a crime in your sleep and escape punishment, what did that say about the predictability of human nature? You might also hear whispers of cases where individuals attempted to use sleepwalking as a defense for seemingly mundane yet socially disruptive acts. A man might claim he sleepwalked into a neighbor's yard and stole their chickens, or a woman might declare she sleepwalked her way to a clandestine meeting with a forbidden lover. While these certainly didn't carry the same legal weight as murder, they highlighted the pervasive anxiety surrounding unconscious actions and their potential for social transgression. The very idea that one's body could act independently of one's conscious moral compass was deeply unsettling in a society built on strict codes of conduct. The legal labyrinth was therefore not just about crime, but about the very definition of a responsible citizen. It forced a conversation about the boundaries of the self, and whether the sleeping self was truly part of the waking self in a legal sense. The Victorian judges, bless their formal robes and stern expressions, were trying to fit a round peg of unconscious behavior into the very square hole of their established legal framework. It was a testament to the enduring mystery of sleepwalking that even the seemingly impenetrable walls of the courthouse struggled to contain its unsettling implications. And as you left the public gallery, the whispered arguments of the barristers still echoing in your mind, you might ponder the strange justice of a world where one could be a law-abiding citizen by day and a baffling, blameless criminal by night. Stepping away from the stern pronouncements of the courtroom and the often grim realities of legal responsibility, you now find yourself back in the more intimate, yet equally anxious, setting of the Victorian home. Here, in the very heart of domesticity, sleepwalking manifested not as a legal conundrum or a literary trope, but as a genuine source of daily distress and pervasive fear. For many Victorian families, a sleepwalker in their midst was far more than a curious phenomenon. It was a living, breathing challenge to their carefully constructed world of order, privacy, and respectable appearances. Imagine, if you will, a typical middle-class household. The evenings are spent in quiet pursuits, reading by the fire, needlework, perhaps a game of cards. Strict routines govern bedtime, lights extinguished, hushed goodnights exchanged. Then, in the deep quiet of the night, a creak on the stairs, a muffled thud, the chilling realization that someone, perhaps a beloved child, a spouse, or even a trusted servant, is no longer safely tucked in bed, but is instead wandering the darkened halls, completely unconscious. The sheer vulnerability of it all was terrifying. The primary concern, naturally, was the danger to the sleepwalker themselves. Victorian homes, for all their grandeur, were not exactly child-proofed or sleepwalker-friendly. Grand staircases, often uncarpeted, presented a perilous descent. Open windows, roaring fires in grates, and delicate, easily breakable objects were everywhere. A sleepwalker could easily fall, trip, burn themselves, or wander out into the dangerous, disease-ridden streets of London or any other bustling city. For parents, the fear of their child inadvertently harming themselves was a constant, gnawing worry that often led to sleepless nights for the watchful, waking family members. You might find a worried mother or father creeping silently to their child's bedside every hour just to ensure they were still safely tucked beneath their quilts, beyond physical danger. There was the profound concern for propriety and reputation. In Victorian society, appearances were everything. A well-ordered home with well-behaved occupants reflected positively on the family's standing. A sleepwalker, particularly if they wandered unclothed or partially clothed, or if they performed bizarre actions witnessed by others, could bring immense shame and scandal upon the household. Imagine the horror if your daughter, known for her delicate sensibility, was discovered by a peering neighbor sleepwalking in the garden in her nightdress. It was enough to cause a genuine social crisis within the family, leading to hushed whispers and frantic attempts to keep the condition a secret. Good heavens, darling, did anyone see you talking to that rose bush last night? This fear of exposure often led to elaborate domestic measures to contain the sleepwalker. Doors to bedrooms might be locked from the outside, a terrifying thought in case of fire, but a measure of desperation. Bells might be rigged to doorknobs or windows, designed to jingle and alert the waking family members if the sleepwalker attempted to exit. Some families even resorted to tying a rope around the sleepwalker's ankle, connecting it to a bedpost, a crude but often necessary means of restraint. It sounds terribly invasive, doesn't it? But for a family desperate to prevent harm or public humiliation, such measures were considered justifiable. Mainstream historical fact: sleepwalking in Victorian homes posed significant domestic challenges, primarily due to concerns for the sleepwalkers' physical safety and the preservation of family reputation in a society obsessed with propriety. This led to various, often rudimentary, domestic precautions and anxieties about public exposure. You would find advice columns in popular magazines discussing how best to manage a sleepwalking family member, though the advice was often more about containment than cure. A quirky or fringe tidbit concerns the often inventive, and sometimes frankly bizarre, alarm systems invented by desperate Victorians. Beyond bells and ropes, some more mechanically inclined individuals designed contraptions involving buckets of water rigged to fall if a bedroom door opened, or complex arrangements of tins and strings that would clatter noisily. One anecdotal account describes a device that would literally dump cold water on the sleepwalker's face if they stood up from bed. While probably more fiction than widespread practice, these tales highlight the extreme lengths to which families would go to prevent their loved ones from wandering off into the dangerous night. A rather shocking remedy, dear, but effective, I assure you. The emotional toll on families was immense. Living with a sleepwalker meant constant vigilance, fragmented sleep for everyone, and a pervasive sense of helplessness. It could strain marital relationships, as one spouse might blame the other for passing on the affliction. Children who sleepwalked might be viewed with a mix of pity and fear, leading to overprotection, or, in some unfortunate cases, outright ostracization within the family unit. The very concept of the safe haven that the home was supposed to represent was fundamentally undermined by the unpredictable, unconscious movements of a family member. Historians still argue whether the domestic anxieties surrounding sleepwalking contributed to its medicalization, pushing families to seek professional help, or if the medicalization simply provided a new framework for anxieties that already existed. Was the doctor called because sleepwalking was newly understood as a disease? Or was the doctor called because families desperately needed a scientific explanation and solution for their nightly ordeal? It's a dance between cause and effect, isn't it? The class dimension also played a role. While sleepwalking could affect anyone, the domestic measures and public scrutiny might differ. A wealthy family might be able to afford a dedicated night nurse or a larger, more secure home. A poorer family, living in cramped conditions, might find it almost impossible to contain a sleepwalker, leading to greater risk and potential public exposure, which could, in turn, impact their already precarious social standing or employment opportunities. Imagine a factory worker who, in his sleep, wanders onto the shop floor, potentially causing an accident. His employment might be jeopardized, not because of malicious intent, but simply because of an uncontrollable bodily function. Furthermore, sleepwalking often became a metaphor for deeper, unspoken domestic tensions. In an era where emotions were often repressed and difficult conversations avoided, the sleepwalker's unconscious actions could inadvertently reveal family secrets, hidden desires, or simmering resentments. A wife might, in her sleep, utter the name of a forbidden lover. A child might reveal an abusive situation they consciously kept quiet about. The sleepwalker became a truth-teller, albeit an unwilling and unconscious one, adding another layer of anxiety to an already fraught household. It was the ultimate nightmare for families built on a veneer of polite silence. Ultimately, the Victorian home, for all its pretensions of calm and order, could become a stage for the bewildering drama of sleepwalking. It forced families to confront the unpredictable nature of the human mind, the fragility of control, and the constant threat of public exposure. For you, perhaps a quiet Victorian housewife, the rustle of a nightdress in the hall or a soft thud from an upstairs room would be enough to send a shiver down your spine. A reminder that even within the walls of your own cherished home, the mysteries of the night held sway, waiting to unravel the carefully woven fabric of your domestic peace. Having explored the anxieties that sleepwalking stirred within the confines of the Victorian home and the perplexing legal battles it ignited, your journey through this curious history now leads you to a rather less comforting destination: the asylums and treatments devised for those deemed to be suffering from somnambulism. For many Victorians, especially if their sleepwalking was severe, dangerous, or accompanied by other nervous symptoms, the path often led to institutionalization and a range of cures that varied wildly in their efficacy, and sometimes in their sheer brutality. Remember, the Victorian era was a time of burgeoning, but still very crude, medical understanding. There was a desperate desire to categorize, label, and treat all manner of ailments, both physical and mental. Sleepwalking, particularly when it went beyond simple nocturnal wanderings and verged into violent or persistently disruptive behavior, was often seen as a symptom of deeper madness or a derangement of the nervous system. If you or a loved one were prone to scaling rooftops in your sleep or engaging in complex, dangerous activities, it wouldn't be long before the family doctor, perhaps at his wit's end, would suggest a period of rest and recovery in a specialized institution. These institutions, often euphemistically called asylums or hospitals for the insane, ranged from private, relatively comfortable, if restrictive establishments for the wealthy to sprawling, overcrowded, and often grim public institutions for the poor. The philosophy behind them was often a blend of moral treatment, kindness, routine, fresh air, and physical restraint, with a heavy dose of trial-and-error cures. For a sleepwalker, the asylum offered a controlled environment where they could, theoretically, be protected from self-harm and kept from disturbing others. However, it also meant a profound loss of freedom and dignity. Mainstream historical fact: Victorian asylums and private lunatic hospitals became common destinations for individuals exhibiting severe or persistent sleepwalking, where a variety of often ineffective and sometimes harsh treatments were employed, reflecting the limited medical understanding of neurological and psychiatric conditions at the time. These institutions, though intended for care, often relied on restraint and isolation. You would find detailed asylum registers noting somnambulism alongside other diagnoses, revealing the prevailing classification of the condition. The treatments for sleepwalking were a fascinating and often disturbing reflection of the ERA's medical theories. If the cause was believed to be an imbalance of humors, you might be subjected to purges to empty the bowels, emetics to induce vomiting, or even bloodletting, where leeches were applied or veins were cut to rebalance the bodily fluids. Imagine waking up in an asylum to find a plump leech leisurely enjoying its breakfast on your arm, all in the name of curing your nighttime ramblings. It sounds more likely to induce a new form of sleep-disordered breathing from sheer terror if the nervous system was thought to be the culprit. The remedies became even more imaginative. Patients might be subjected to cold water treatments involving dousing with freezing water or prolonged immersion in frigid baths, believed to shock the nervous system back into proper functioning. Or perhaps they would be given sedatives, concoctions of opium, laudanum, or bromide, designed to suppress the nervous activity that supposedly led to sleepwalking. These often left patients in a perpetual state of grogginess, trading one form of unconsciousness for another. You might also encounter Faradayization, an early form of electrotherapy where mild electrical currents were passed through the body, believed to stimulate nerves and muscles. It sounds rather like being zapped by a very polite lightning bolt, doesn't it? Just a little shock, dear sir, for your nighttime wanderings. A quirky or fringe tidbit from asylum life was the belief in moral management as a cure for sleepwalking, particularly if it was seen as linked to hysteria or a lack of self-control. This involved strict routines, forced manual labor like gardening or laundry, bland diets, and constant supervision, all designed to instill discipline and correct the patient's moral fiber. The idea was that by imposing order on the waking life, the unconscious mind would eventually follow suit. So, if you sleepwalked, you might find yourself peeling potatoes for hours or scrubbing floors, all to convince your subconscious to stay. In bed, it sounds like a remarkably tedious form of therapy, doesn't it? The asylum environment itself, though intended to be therapeutic, could often exacerbate the very conditions it sought to treat. The lack of privacy, the often harsh conditions, the forced routines, and the psychological impact of being labeled insane could deeply affect a sleepwalker's mental state. Imagine being confined to a ward, constantly observed, knowing that any nighttime movement could lead to further restraint or more unpleasant treatments. It was a far cry from the comforting atmosphere of your own bedroom. Historians still argue whether the institutionalization of sleepwalkers was genuinely beneficial in terms of safety and potential cure, or if it primarily served to remove troublesome individuals from society and family life, reinforcing social control. Was it care or containment? The reality was likely a complex blend, with some individuals finding a measure of stability in the structured environment, while many others suffered from the often punitive and unscientific practices. For those wealthy enough, private institutions offered a slightly more genteel experience, though the treatments were often similar in principle. Here, you might find more comfortable rooms, better food, and perhaps even some recreational activities. But the fundamental loss of autonomy remained. The stigma of having been away in an asylum, even a private one, could follow a person for years, impacting their social standing and marriage prospects. The Victorian medical community, despite its limitations, was genuinely trying to understand and alleviate suffering. However, their theories were often based on observation rather than deep scientific insight, leading to methods that we would now consider misguided or even dangerous. The sleepwalker, therefore, became a subject for experimentation, a canvas upon which the latest, often fleeting, medical fads were painted. You, observing these scenes, would feel a profound sense of pity for those confined within these walls. Their nighttime wanderings, already a mystery, now compounded by the cold logic of institutional care. The irony was that the very environment designed to bring peace to the disturbed mind often created new forms of anxiety and distress. And as you pass by the high walls of the asylum, the distant, muffled cries of its residents, a chilling reminder. You might be acutely grateful for the relative privacy and safety of your own bed, however unpredictable your own dreams might be. Having explored the often draconian cures administered within Victorian asylums, Your historical journey now shifts to a profoundly influential, albeit emerging, perspective that began to cast its long shadow over the understanding of sleepwalking. Freud's shadow looms. While Sigmund Freud himself was still developing his groundbreaking theories towards the very end of the Victorian era and well into the Edwardian period, the seeds of psychoanalysis were being sown, and early psychological interpretations began to seep into the public and medical consciousness, fundamentally altering how conditions like somnambulism were viewed before Freud. As you've seen, explanations for sleepwalking largely oscillated between the supernatural, the physiological, imbalances of humors, nervous disorders, and vague notions of hysteria. The idea that complex hidden mental processes, particularly unconscious ones, could be driving such bizarre behavior was revolutionary. Freud, building on the work of earlier hypnotists and neurologists like Jean-Martin Charcot, proposed that sleepwalking wasn't just a physical malfunction but a manifestation of repressed desires, unresolved conflicts, or traumatic memories bubbling up from the hidden depths of the psyche. Imagine yourself as a Victorian doctor, accustomed to prescribing leeches or cold baths, suddenly confronted with the idea that your patient's nocturnal ramblings were not due to an irregular flow of nervous fluid, but perhaps because they unconsciously resented their tyrannical father, or secretly yearned for a life forbidden by social convention. It was a radical, unsettling thought that shifted the focus from the body's mechanics to the mind's mysterious internal landscape. It suggested that even in sleep, you were actively, if unconsciously, doing something with your mind, rather than simply malfunctioning. Freud's key contribution was the concept of the unconscious mind, a vast reservoir of thoughts, memories, and desires that are inaccessible to conscious awareness but profoundly influence our behavior. Sleep, for Freud, was not merely a period of rest, but a fertile ground where these repressed contents could manifest, often in disguised or symbolic forms. Dreams, of course, were the royal road to the unconscious, but sleepwalking offered an even more dramatic, literal enactment of these hidden urges. If you were sleepwalking, you weren't just dreaming. You were living your dream, often acting out what your waking mind rigidly suppressed. Consider a typical Victorian gentleman, bound by strict societal rules, emotional repression, and the relentless pressure to maintain a respectable facade. What if, in his sleep, he found himself wandering to the home of a forbidden lover, or assaulting a rival in a dreamlike state, or even expressing desires that were utterly scandalous in his waking life? Freud would suggest that these actions were not random, but were symbolic enactments of his unfulfilled desires or unacknowledged conflicts. The sleepwalker wasn't mad in the traditional sense. They were merely expressing what their conscious mind refused to acknowledge. Mainstream historical fact. Towards the end of the Victorian era, the nascent field of psychoanalysis, spearheaded by figures like Sigmund Freud, began to offer a profound, new interpretation of sleepwalking, seeing it as a manifestation of the unconscious mind and repressed psychological conflicts, moving beyond purely physiological or moral explanations. While Freud's theories became more widespread in the 20th century, their roots in late Victorian thought challenged prevailing medical and public views. You could feel the intellectual ground shifting beneath your feet. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to this emerging psychological view was the idea of somnambulistic amnesia being a protective mechanism. If a sleepwalker committed an act that was socially unacceptable or deeply shameful, the ensuing amnesia, their lack of memory upon waking, wasn't just a symptom, but a psychological defense, allowing the conscious mind to avoid confronting the uncomfortable truths revealed by the unconscious. It was as if your brain was saying, "You definitely didn't just climb onto the roof and bark at the moon, because you can't remember it, can you? Perfect." This offered a slightly more charitable, if equally unsettling, explanation for the memory blanks. This new Freudian lens began to explain why some sleepwalkers might perform complex, inspiciously purposeful actions rather than just aimless wandering. The actions had meaning, even if that meaning was hidden from the conscious individual. This opened up the possibility of therapy, not just physical restraint or sedatives, but talking cures, dream analysis, and introspection aimed at uncovering the root psychological conflict that manifested as sleepwalking. Of course, the formal practice of psychoanalysis was still decades away from widespread acceptance in England, but the seeds of this approach were undoubtedly present. Historians still argue whether Freud's theories truly represented a radical break from previous thought, or if they were an evolution of existing ideas about the unconscious. Mesmerism and hysteria that had been simmering in Victorian intellectual circles for decades. Was he a true pioneer or a brilliant synthesizer? Regardless, his specific framework and emphasis on sexuality and repression certainly provided a powerful new vocabulary and methodology for understanding conditions like sleepwalking. The impact of this emerging psychological perspective on the public was gradual but profound. It added a new layer of complexity to the already mysterious sleepwalker. Now, it wasn't just about danger or public scandal. It was about the dark secrets and hidden desires that might lurk within anyone. This could be both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying, because it suggested that you might not truly know yourself. Liberating, because it offered a framework for understanding seemingly irrational behavior as meaningful, even if the meaning was unconscious. It shifted the blame from moral failing to psychological distress, potentially reducing some of the societal shame associated with such conditions. You might hear whispers in intellectual circles about the talking cure, or the idea that dreams hold secret messages. These concepts, though initially met with skepticism and often ridicule, slowly began to challenge the prevailing notion of the human mind as a purely rational, conscious entity. The sleepwalker became a potent symbol of this hidden, powerful, unconscious, a living testament to the fact that there was more to you than met the eye, even your own. This evolving understanding meant that the conversation around sleepwalking began to incorporate concepts of early childhood experiences, trauma, and repressed emotions. Instead of simply trying to stop the physical act, there was a tentative move towards understanding why the act was occurring. It was a slow, sometimes frustrating process, but it marked a significant step towards modern psychological approaches to sleep disorders. So, as the Victorian era drew to a close, and the gas lamps gave way to electric light, the sleepwalker stood at the precipice of a new dawn of understanding. No longer just a victim of demons or bodily humors, they were now seen as a complex psychological entity, their nocturnal wanderings a silent, dramatic play enacted by the powerful, enigmatic forces of the unconscious mind. And for you, the individual, it posed a new, unsettling question. What secrets did your sleeping mind hold, waiting for the perfect moment to break free and perform its own silent drama? It was enough to make you wonder if you truly knew yourself, even in the comforting solitude of your own bed. Stepping out of the nascent psychological theories of Freud and back into the bustling, information-hungry streets of Victorian England, you immediately encounter another powerful force that shaped public perceptions of sleepwalking: the rampant spread of the urban legend. The Victorian era, with its rapidly expanding literacy rates and the booming penny press, was a fertile ground for sensational stories and sleepwalking. With its inherent mystery and dramatic potential, became a prime candidate for exaggerated tales that spiraled into widespread, often terrifying, urban myths. Imagine yourself flipping through a cheap newsprint paper, perhaps while waiting for a crowded omnibus. The headlines scream about a midnight marauder or a somnambulist slayer. These weren't necessarily true crime reports. Often, they were thinly veiled fiction or grotesque exaggerations of real, often mundane, incidents. But in a world where verifiable information was harder to come by, and where people genuinely craved excitement and a good scare, these stories took root and flourished, becoming part of the collective consciousness. The more outlandish the tale, the more likely it was to be retold, embellished, and believed. These urban legends often played on existing anxieties. If you were already worried about crime in the burgeoning, chaotic cities, the idea of a sleepwalker committing a heinous act, a murder, a robbery, an arson, without conscious intent, was uniquely terrifying. It suggested a threat that was invisible, unpredictable, and could come from anywhere, even from within the seemingly safe confines of a respectable home. How do you guard against someone who is both perpetrator and victim? It was a chilling thought, and the newspapers were only too happy to exploit it. Mainstream historical fact, sensationalized newspaper reports, penny dreadfuls, and word of mouth contributed significantly to the creation and propagation of urban legends surrounding sleepwalking in Victorian England, often depicting somnambulists as dangerous, unpredictable figures capable of complex, even criminal acts. These stories, whether based on scant fact or pure fiction, fueled both public fascination and a pervasive, often irrational, fear of nocturnal wanderers. You couldn't escape them. They were the viral content of the day, passed from mouth to mouth, ink to paper. A common theme in these urban legends was the sleepwalker, performing acts of incredible strength or agility. There were tales of delicate women sleepwalking onto narrow window ledges, several stories high, or burly men carrying impossibly heavy objects across a yard. These stories tapped into the awe of the unknown, suggesting a hidden power released when the conscious mind was at rest. Did you hear about the young chimney sweep who, in his sleep, scaled the very highest spire of Westminster Abbey, and he'd never even climbed a ladder in his waking life? These tales, while obviously exaggerated, contributed to the idea that sleepwalking was a state of heightened, albeit unconscious, capability. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this era was the recurring legend of the sleepwalking doppelganger. This myth suggested that a person's sleepwalking self was almost a separate, autonomous entity, a shadowy twin that emerged at night. Sometimes this doppelganger would perform good deeds, like finishing chores or mending clothes, leaving the waking person utterly bewildered. More often, however, the sleepwalking doppelganger was mischievous or even malevolent, committing petty acts of vandalism, revealing embarrassing secrets, or simply terrifying family members with their eerie, unseeing gaze. This concept lent a supernatural, almost spiritualist, dimension to the urban legends, reinforcing the idea that the sleepwalker was not truly themselves. It wasn't him who ate all the biscuits, dear. It was his sleepwalking shadow. The sensationalism wasn't just limited to crime. Stories of sleepwalkers revealing hidden inheritances, unmasking imposters, or finding lost treasures were also popular. These legends offered a more positive, albeit equally fantastical, spin on the phenomenon, suggesting that the unconscious mind held not just darkness, but also profound, untapped knowledge. It was like a treasure map hidden within your own brain, only accessible when you were completely out of it. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of these urban legends indicates a widespread underlying anxiety about mental control and personal responsibility in a rapidly changing society, or if it was simply a byproduct of a burgeoning mass media hungry for content. Were these stories a reflection of deep-seated fears, or did they actively create those fears? The answer is likely both. The stories provided a tangible form for nebulous anxieties, giving them shape and narrative. The vivid imagery used in these newspaper accounts and penny dreadfuls was crucial. They described sleepwalkers with glassy, unseeing eyes, moving with an eerie, mechanical precision, or having a ghostly pallor in the moonlight. This painted a picture of someone who was both human and profoundly other, a disturbing figure that stalked the night. You would be captivated by these descriptions, perhaps finding yourself checking your windows and doors a second time before bed. The impact of these urban legends was pervasive. They informed popular culture, leading to caricatures of sleepwalkers in music halls and satirical cartoons. They influenced personal anecdotes, with people often embellishing their own or their neighbors' sleepwalking incidents to fit the dramatic narrative of the latest newspaper tale. It shaped policy and public debate, too, creating pressure on authorities to deal with sleepwalkers, even if the actual danger was minimal compared to the fictionalized accounts. These legends also served a curious psychological function for the Victorian public. By externalizing the fear of the unknown into the figure of the sleepwalker, it provided a way to grapple with unsettling realities. The sleepwalker became a scapegoat for anxieties about social disorder, the unpredictability of human nature, and the limits of scientific understanding. It was easier to fear the midnight marauder than to confront the complexities of psychological distress or the moral ambiguities of true crime. You, caught in the currents of Victorian society, would find yourself both thrilled and unnerved by these tales. They were the gossip of the age, the water cooler conversations, the things that made you lean in closer. They turned a curious medical anomaly into a national phenomenon, making the sleepwalker a familiar, if unsettling, figure in the collective imagination. And as you finished reading the latest installment of The Phantom Somnambulist of Whitechapel, you might pull your covers a little tighter, wondering if the next knock at your door wouldn't be the milkman, but something far more perplexing. A figure emerging from the deepest, most sensationalized corners of the Victorian night. Having explored the dramatic narratives spun by urban legends, you now step into another fascinating, albeit less thrilling aspect of the Victorian grappling with sleepwalking, the emergence of technological interventions. You see, for all the talk of humors, spirits, and psychological depths, the Victorians were also intensely pragmatic, faced with a problem, particularly one that caused domestic disturbance or public concern. Their inventive minds often turned to mechanical solutions. While modern sleep medicine relies on sophisticated diagnostics, the Victorians were working with what they had: springs, wires, bells, and a healthy dose of hopeful ingenuity. Imagine a concerned Victorian paterfamilias, thoroughly exasperated by his sleepwalking son's nocturnal excursions down the grand staircase. He's tried locking the door. He's tried tying a rope to the boy's ankle. He's even considered a cold bath, much to the boy's chagrin, and likely limited success. What's next? Why, a mechanical device, of course. This was an era of tinkering, of patents for every conceivable invention. And the problem of sleepwalking, being both mysterious and potentially dangerous, cried out for a mechanical answer. These early technological interventions were, by modern standards, incredibly rudimentary, often resembling Rube Goldberg machines designed to achieve a very simple purpose: detect the sleepwalker, or, ideally, wake them up. They were born out of necessity and a desire to impose order on a chaotic, unconscious behavior. The focus was less on understanding the cause of sleepwalking and more on preventing its outward manifestations. One of the most common and conceptually simple interventions involved various forms of alarms. These ranged from simple bells rigged to the sleepwalker's bed or door, designed to jingle if disturbed, to more elaborate systems. You might find a delicate tripwire stretched across the bedroom floor, connected to a series of weighted pulleys that would clang a bell or drop a pot if someone stumbled over it. The aim was to create enough noise to startle the sleepwalker back to consciousness, or at the very least, to alert a watchful family member. For you, trying to get a decent night's sleep in a house rigged with such contraptions, it must have been a noisy affair. One might accidentally trip the alarm just reaching for a glass of water, much to the exasperation of the entire household. Mainstream historical fact: Victorian ingenuity led to the invention and limited adoption of various rudimentary mechanical devices and alarm systems designed to detect, prevent, or awaken sleepwalkers, reflecting a practical, albeit simplistic, approach to managing the condition. These inventions, often patented, showcased a pragmatic desire to control nocturnal wandering through physical means rather than solely relying on medical or psychological interventions. You might even stumble upon old patent drawings depicting elaborate contraptions intended to keep sleepwalkers safely in their beds. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this era includes more restrictive, almost disciplinary devices. There were anecdotal accounts, and even some designs, for specialized garments or harnesses designed to physically prevent a sleepwalker from getting out of bed. Imagine a sort of straitjacket for bedtime, or a leather harness that would anchor the sleepwalker to their mattress. While likely uncomfortable and rarely effective in the long run, a determined sleepwalker is a surprisingly strong sleepwalker. These ideas underscore the desperate lengths to which Victorians would go to control the uncontrollable. One can only imagine the sheer discomfort and potential chafing involved in a night spent tethered to one's bed like a prize pig. Darling, is that leather squeaking again, or are you just trying to escape? Beyond mere alarms, some inventors attempted to design devices that would actively prevent a sleepwalker from leaving their bed. One concept involved a bed with a complex system of hinged side rails that would automatically swing up and lock if the sleeper attempted to rise, essentially turning the bed into a cage. Another, even more elaborate idea proposed a mat placed beside the bed that, if stepped on, would trigger a mechanism to either sound an alarm or perhaps even trigger a gentle spray of water to the face, a softer version of the cold bath treatment. These were less about waking the sleepwalker mid-act and more about ensuring they never began their perambulations in the first place. The underlying philosophy behind these technological interventions was often a materialistic one. If sleepwalking was a physical problem, then it required a physical solution. It bypassed the murky waters of psychological distress or supernatural influence and went straight for the tangible. This reflected a certain Victorian faith in mechanical progress, a belief that any problem, given enough ingenuity, could be solved with gears, levers, and springs. Historians still argue whether the invention of these devices reflected a genuine increase in sleepwalking cases that necessitated such measures, or if it was simply a natural byproduct of an inventive age, looking for new problems to solve and new patents to file. Were people genuinely more prone to sleepwalking, or was it just a new market for inventors to exploit? The truth, as often is the case, is likely a mix of both. A problem existing and inventive minds seizing the opportunity to offer a solution. However quirky, the effectiveness of these devices, as you might imagine, was highly questionable. Alarms might startle a mild sleepwalker, but a more determined one might simply deactivate them or learn to ignore them. Physical restraints could be dangerous or simply overcome with enough unconscious force, and the psychological impact of being treated like a caged animal or constantly being startled awake could hardly have been beneficial for the sleepwalker's overall well-being. It sounds like a recipe for a very grumpy, sleep-deprived individual, doesn't it? Despite their limitations, these technological interventions offer a fascinating glimpse into the Victorian mind. They reveal a society that, even while grappling with complex medical and spiritual explanations, still held a profound belief in the power of human ingenuity to control and overcome perceived defects. They wanted order, and if that order couldn't come from internal mental processes, then it would be imposed externally by clever machines. You might even find advertisements in old Victorian journals for these somnambulist alarms or nighttime wanderer preventers, often promising a return to peaceful, uninterrupted sleep for the entire family. The language would be confident, perhaps a little bombastic, assuring the reader that their nocturnal worries could be banished with a clever arrangement of brass and clockwork. Ultimately, while these contraptions didn't offer a definitive cure for sleepwalking, they represent a unique chapter in its history. They highlight the enduring human desire to find practical solutions to perplexing problems, even when those problems delve into the mysterious realms of the unconscious mind. And as you consider these bizarre inventions, you might find yourself silently grateful for modern understanding, and perhaps for simply a comfortable bed and an uninterrupted night's sleep, free from the clanging of bells or the unwelcome splash of cold water. Having explored the rather ingenious, albeit often ineffective, mechanical contraptions designed to curb nocturnal wanderings, your historical lens now pivots to another powerful medium through which Victorian society grappled with and represented sleepwalking, its artistic interpretations. The visual arts, from grand oil paintings to popular prints and illustrations in magazines, offered a different kind of narrative, capturing the eerie mystique of the somnambulist in ways that words alone could not. These depictions both reflected and shaped public understanding, turning a medical anomaly into a captivating visual motif. Imagine yourself strolling through the Royal Academy's summer exhibition, the air thick with the smell of oil paint and polite conversation. Suddenly, your gaze falls upon a large canvas. It depicts a pale, draped figure, eyes wide open yet clearly unseeing, navigating a moonlit landscape or a shadowy interior. This was the sleepwalker, as artistic subject, potent symbol of the unconscious, the uncanny, and the fragile boundary between waking and dreaming. Artists were drawn to sleepwalking for its inherent dramatic potential and its rich symbolic possibilities. It offered a chance to explore themes of vulnerability, mystery, madness, and the hidden depths of the human psyche. The contrast between the figure's active body and inert mind was visually compelling. How do you convey consciousness without depicting seeing eyes? How do you show movement that is purposeful yet utterly devoid of intent? These were challenges that artists relished. One of the most common artistic interpretations depicted the sleepwalker in a state of suspended animation, often with a dreamlike quality. The lighting would be soft, often moonlight, casting long, dramatic shadows. The figure would be draped in white or light-colored nightclothes, emphasizing their ghost-like presence. Their face might show an expression of serene detachment, or perhaps a hint of inner torment. The setting was often crucial: a winding staircase, a moonlit garden, or a shadowy corridor, all serving to heighten the sense of eerie vulnerability. Mainstream historical fact: Victorian visual arts frequently depicted sleepwalking, often emphasizing the mystery, vulnerability, and uncanny nature of the somnambulist through evocative lighting, symbolic settings, and the portrayal of figures in a trance-like state. These artistic representations solidified the sleepwalker as a powerful cultural archetype, contributing to both fascination and apprehension. You would see this theme recurring in various forms, from academic paintings intended for prestigious exhibitions to popular engravings found in illustrated periodicals. A particularly poignant example, though it just predates the Victorian era, is Henry Fuseli's The Nightmare 1781, which, while not explicitly depicting sleepwalking, powerfully captured the nocturnal terror and the feeling of being assailed in one's sleep. Its influence resonated throughout the Victorian era, inspiring artists to delve into the psychological unease of the nighttime. You can easily imagine a Victorian artist inspired by Fuseli's unsettling vision, turning their brush to the equally mysterious figure of the sleepwalker. A quirky or fringe tidbit in these artistic interpretations was the occasional allegorical use of sleepwalking to comment on social or political issues. For instance, a political cartoon might depict a government minister sleepwalking through a crisis, eyes wide open, but clearly oblivious to the chaos around him, symbolizing incompetence or detachment. Or a satirical print might show Victorian society itself, elegantly dressed, but sleepwalking towards some impending doom, blind to the social inequalities festering beneath the surface. These humorous or critical uses of the somnambulist highlight how deeply the concept had permeated popular culture, becoming a readily understood visual shorthand for unconscious action or willful ignorance. Oh, look, there's Parliament, sleepwalking its way to another scandalous decision. The rise of mass-produced prints and illustrated magazines meant that these contemplative artistic interpretations reached a wider audience than ever before. No longer confined to the galleries of the elite, images of sleepwalkers circulated widely, reinforcing public perceptions and perhaps even influencing individual experiences. If you saw enough dramatic depictions of sleepwalkers falling from heights, you might genuinely start to worry more about such dangers. These images helped to make the abstract concept of an unconscious mind concrete and visually memorable. Historians still argue whether these artistic portrayals were primarily a reflection of actual societal anxieties about mental health and control, or if they were largely driven by the aesthetic appeal and dramatic potential of the subject itself. Was art holding a mirror to society, or was it actively shaping the collective imagination of what a sleepwalker should look like and what they could do? It's a chicken and egg scenario for the art historians, isn't it? The depiction of the sleepwalker also often carried a subtle moral or psychological message. In some cases, the sleepwalker was portrayed sympathetically, as a victim of an affliction beyond their control, evoking pity. In others, particularly in more sensationalist prints, there was an element of voyeurism, a fascination with the uninhibited actions of a person freed from social constraint, even if only in their sleep. This duality, sympathy versus sensationalism, was characteristic of much of Victorian art, dealing with themes of madness and altered states. Artists also used the sleepwalker to explore the beauty and terror of the subconscious. The dreamlike quality often present in these works hinted at the inner world of the figure, suggesting that even in sleep the mind was active, perhaps wrestling with unseen forces or experiencing profound, if unspoken, emotions. This resonated with the growing interest in psychology even before Freud had fully articulated his theories. Think of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, with their focus on dreamlike states, symbolic narratives, and intense emotional expression. While not universally depicting sleepwalkers, their general aesthetic created a fertile ground for such themes. The idea of a beautiful figure lost in a trance was profoundly appealing to an artistic movement that valued emotional depth and symbolic meaning over strict realism. Ultimately, the artistic interpretations of sleepwalking added a crucial visual dimension to its cultural understanding in Victorian England. They transformed a mysterious medical condition into a powerful symbol, a visual shorthand for the human mind's hidden depths and unpredictable nature. For you, the Victorian viewer, these images were both captivating and unsettling, a constant reminder that even in the quiet of the night, and even within the confines of your own body, there were realms of experience that defied rational explanation, expressed through the silent, haunting movements of the somnambulist. And as you left the gallery, the image of a pale figure drifting through moonlit shadows might just linger in your mind, a testament to art's enduring power to make the invisible visible. Having witnessed the artistic interpretations that gave form to the enigmatic sleepwalker, Your journey now shifts to a particularly vulnerable group within Victorian society, its children. While sleepwalking could afflict anyone, childhood somnambulism carried its own unique set of anxieties, fears, and often misguided attempts at treatment. In an era that simultaneously sentimentalized and disciplined its young, a child prone to nocturnal wanderings presented a distinct challenge to the ideals of innocence, order, and parental control. Imagine a Victorian nursery, perhaps dimly lit by a nightlight, the air hushed save for the rhythmic breathing of sleeping children. Then a small figure stirs. A child, perhaps no older than 5, rises from there. Cat, eyes open but unseeing, and begins to navigate the room with an eerie, quiet purpose. For the Victorian parent, this wasn't just a curious habit. It was often a source of profound fear and helplessness. Children were seen as delicate, impressionable beings, their minds and bodies still developing. A condition like sleepwalking seemed to threaten their very innocence and proper development. The primary concern, as with adult sleepwalkers, was the child's physical safety. A small child wandering unsupervised in a Victorian house was at immense risk. Stairs, open fires, unguarded windows, and heavy furniture all posed immediate dangers. The fear of a child falling, burning themselves, or wandering out into the perilous streets was a constant, gnawing worry for parents. You can almost feel the parental dread, the silent vigil kept by a mother or nurse, listening for any telltale rustle or creak from the nursery. Did you hear that, dear? Was it little Timothy, or just the house settling? Beyond safety, there was a deeply ingrained cultural anxiety about a child's moral and mental development. Childhood was idealized as a period of purity and moral instruction. If a child sleepwalked, particularly if they performed strange or improper actions, like wandering into a forbidden room or revealing a secret, it raised questions about their inherent nature. Was it a sign of weakness, a precursor to adult madness, or even in lingering superstitious circles, a sign of some early spiritual affliction? This added a heavy burden of guilt and shame for parents, who often felt responsible for every aspect of their child's well-being. Mainstream historical fact: childhood somnambulism in Victorian England was a significant source of parental anxiety, often prompting a mix of protective measures, superstitious beliefs, and early medical interventions aimed at preventing harm and ensuring the child's proper development. Concerns for a child's safety and moral purity drove many of the responses. You would find mothers exchanging whispered advice on remedies, ranging from herbal concoctions to prayer. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this period revolves around the belief that certain nervous habits in children, including sleepwalking, could be caused by excessive study or overstimulation of the brain. The idea was that too much intellectual activity, particularly late at night, could exhaust the delicate nervous system of a child and lead to nocturnal unrest. Parents might therefore limit their child's reading time, forbid exciting stories before bed, or even pull them out of school temporarily, believing a simpler, less stimulating existence would calm their nerves and stop the sleepwalking. It's almost amusing to think that reading too much Oliver Twist could literally make you walk in your sleep. Put down that book, young lady, before you wander into the pantry again. The medical community, in its nascent understanding of neurology and child psychology, offered various explanations and treatments for childhood somnambulism. Some doctors attributed it to teething, digestive issues, or even worms, prescribing various purges and tonics. Others saw it as a form of juvenile hysteria, particularly in girls, recommending calming environments, strict routines, or even mild sedatives. The aim was always to break the habit and ensure the child developed into a healthy, well-adjusted adult, free from such unsettling nocturnal quirks. Historians still argue whether the perceived prevalence of childhood sleepwalking during the Victorian era was genuinely higher due to environmental factors like poor nutrition or damp housing, or if it was simply more closely observed and reported due to increased parental awareness and medical interest in child health. Did the industrial cities create more child sleepwalkers, or did the Victorians just start paying more attention to their children's sleep habits? It's a compelling question that lacks a definitive answer. The emotional impact on the sleepwalking child themselves must have been significant. Imagine being a child, waking up with no memory of having traversed the house, perhaps finding yourself in an unfamiliar room, or being told of strange actions you performed while unaware. This could lead to confusion, fear, and a sense of disconnection from their own body. Some children might have felt shame or guilt, internalizing the idea that there was something wrong with them. The stern lectures from parents, however well-intentioned, combined with the often pleasant cures, could have been deeply distressing. The role of the nanny or governess was also crucial. Often, it was their responsibility to monitor the children at night, and a sleepwalking child added immense pressure to their duties. A governess who allowed a child to come to harm while sleepwalking could face severe consequences, including dismissal. This put immense pressure on household staff to be constantly vigilant, reinforcing the domestic anxieties surrounding the condition. Furthermore, childhood sleepwalking sometimes became intertwined with other anxieties about childhood illness and mortality. In an age where childhood diseases were rampant and infant mortality high, any unexplained ailment in a child could trigger deep parental fear. Sleepwalking, with its mysterious origins and unpredictable nature, could easily be interpreted as a sign of something far more serious, even if it was often benign. The Victorians were slowly moving away from the harsher disciplinary methods of previous centuries, embracing a more modern approach to child rearing. However, the fear of sleepwalking often led to measures that would seem restrictive or even cruel by today's standards. Physical restraints, regular waking of the child throughout the night, or the forced consumption of unpleasant tonics were not uncommon. All of this was done from a place of concern, but with very limited scientific understanding. You, observing these anxious parents and bewildered children, would be struck by the pervasive sense of helplessness. Despite their wealth and ingenuity, the Victorians often found themselves at the mercy of conditions they simply didn't understand. Childhood somnambulism, therefore, stands as a poignant example of the era's struggles with both scientific ignorance and deeply ingrained social anxieties, leaving parents to navigate a perplexing nocturnal landscape with little more than their love, their fear, and a handful of often useless remedies. And as you picture a small night-gowned figure silently wandering a dimly lit nursery, you might feel a pang of sympathy for both the child and the parent, caught in the grip of a mystery far older than their modern world. As our journey through the curious history of sleepwalking in Victorian England draws to a close, you find yourself reflecting on the incredible journey this peculiar phenomenon has taken, from ancient superstition to legal quandary, from literary device to a concern for every anxious household. This final section isn't just about wrapping things up. It's about examining the legacy and lingering questions that the Victorian era left us regarding sleepwalking, and how their struggles paved the way for our modern understanding. Even while some mysteries remain stubbornly unsolved, the Victorian period, you see, was a crucial crucible for the understanding of sleepwalking. It was the era that dragged it, kicking and screaming, out of the realm of pure demonic possession and into the nascent fields of medicine and psychology. They were the ones who first truly tried to define it, to categorize it, and to grapple with its implications for individual responsibility and societal order. While their theories were often wild, their treatments sometimes barbaric, and their public perceptions often fueled by sensationalism, they laid the foundational groundwork for what we know today. Think about it. The Victorians gave us the term somnambulism, a widely used medical term even now, a linguistic legacy of their serious, if imperfect, inquiry. They established that sleepwalking was a real physiological phenomenon, not merely a moral failing or a spiritual curse. This was a monumental shift. You, in your modern comfort, might take this understanding for granted, but it was a hard one. Battle against centuries of ignorance and fear. Mainstream historical fact. The Victorian era significantly advanced the medical and cultural understanding of sleepwalking by shifting it from a purely supernatural or moralistic affliction to a recognized, albeit poorly understood, physiological and psychological phenomenon, thereby influencing future scientific inquiry. This foundational shift is perhaps their most enduring legacy in the study of sleep disorders. Without their initial, often fumbling attempts, our modern understanding would be far behind. However, despite these advances, many questions lingered for the Victorians, and some still do for us. The precise cause of sleepwalking remained elusive. Was it inherited? Was it a symptom of other diseases? Was it purely psychological? They had their theories, of course, but lacked the technological tools to truly probe the sleeping brain. The concept of brain waves, sleep cycles, and neurochemical imbalances was still far off. So, for the Victorian doctor, it was often a case of educated guesswork, or, as we've seen, some truly bizarre attempts at cures. A quirky or fringe tidbit from the legacy of Victorian sleepwalking is the enduring popular culture trope of the sleepwalking villain or the sleepwalking detective. Even today, in modern fiction, you'll occasionally encounter characters who perform complex actions in their sleep, either for good or ill. This is a direct inheritance from the sensation novels and penny dreadfuls of the Victorian era, showing how deeply those artistic interpretations permeated the collective imagination. You might find yourself watching a film where a character suddenly starts sleepwalking and uncovers a clue, and you can nod knowingly, tracing that narrative thread back to a gaslit London street. An open, scholarly debate that continues today. Historians still argue whether the complex automatism reported in some Victorian sleepwalking cases, for example, performing intricate tasks, composing music, committing crimes, was genuinely possible for a truly unconscious individual, or if these accounts were largely exaggerated, misreported, or even deliberate hoaxes. Were the extraordinary feats of sleepwalking savants truly possible, or were they products of sensational journalism and wishful thinking? Modern sleep science suggests that while some complex motor actions are possible during sleepwalking, highly detailed, novel, and intellectually demanding tasks are far less likely for a truly unconscious individual. So, was the sleepwalking pianist genuinely playing a concerto, or merely banging on keys in a dream state? The Victorians debated it then, and the debate continues, albeit with more scientific data. Now, the legal legacy of Victorian sleepwalking cases is also significant. Their struggles with the men's redefense laid the groundwork for how modern legal systems approach mental states in criminal responsibility. While the sleepwalking defense is still rare and difficult to prove, it is a recognized, if challenging, argument in many jurisdictions today. The Victorian courts, for all their bewilderment, were forced to acknowledge that an unconscious act might not carry the same culpability as a conscious one. A subtle but profound shift in legal philosophy. The societal legacy is evident in our collective cultural memory. Sleepwalking still carries a certain mystique, a hint of the uncanny. We still use phrases like walking in your sleep to denote unawareness or automatic behavior. The image of the pale, wandering figure remains a potent symbol of something hidden, something beyond our immediate control. You can see it in horror films, in comedic sketches, and in casual conversation. The Victorian era cemented sleepwalking as a cultural touchstone. The Victorian era's relationship with sleepwalking also reflects their broader anxieties about the rapid changes they were experiencing. The Industrial Revolution, the growth of vast, impersonal cities, the challenges to traditional religious beliefs, and the burgeoning scientific understanding of the human body and mind all contributed to a pervasive sense of unease. Sleepwalking, with its unpredictable nature and blurring of boundaries, became a tangible manifestation of these deeper anxieties. It was a condition that defied the neat categorizations they so desperately sought. Ultimately, the Victorian Age, with its gas lamps and its earnest inquiries, its sensational newspapers, and its fledgling medical science, was instrumental in shaping how we think about sleepwalking today. They were the first to systematically observe it, debate it, legislate it, and portray it in art and literature. Their efforts, however imperfect, moved sleepwalking from the realm of pure folklore into the light of scientific investigation, setting the stage for the sophisticated sleep studies and therapies we have now. As you consider all these threads, the fear, the fascination, the science, the fiction, you can appreciate the long, winding path that our understanding of sleep has traveled. The Victorians, in their earnest and often bumbling way, brought sleepwalking into the modern consciousness, challenging us to look beyond the obvious and consider the hidden depths of the human mind. Even when it's supposedly at rest, the gentle hum of the fan, the soft glow of your screen, they're fading now, aren't they? The gas lamps of Victorian London are dimming. The whispered tales of somnambulists settling into the quiet corners of history. You've walked with them, seen their fears, their ingenuity, and their enduring mystery. Let the figures of those nocturnal wanderers, those unseeing dreamers, drift away now. Your journey through their curious history is complete. Feel the weight of your eyelids, the comfort of your bed. The night is quiet, and the only secrets it holds now are your own sweet dreams.